Welcome everyone to another very special episode of Forwards in Focus, the official podcast of Haverford Athletics. I'm your host, Matt Nissenfeld, and today we continue with the Diversity and Inclusion 3-day social media campaign sponsored by the NCAA, with today's theme being leveling the playing field, as we explore what student athletes, coaches, and administrators are doing to level the playing field for student athletes, coaches, and administrators holding historically underserved identities. To go along with this theme, we'll be talking about A Long Talk, which is a program our winter teams went through centered around anti-racism. I'm joined today by three of our student athletes, if you would like to just say your name and what sport you belong to here at Haverford.
I'm Ben Zimmerman. I'm part of the men's basketball program.
I'm Brianna Feifer. I'm a captain of the women's basketball team and also on outdoor track and field.
I'm Aman Hamdard. I'm a junior on the women's squash team.
Awesome. So all three of our student athletes will be joining myself as we talk about the A Long Talk program and training. Now, for all of you like myself that have not been familiarized with A Long Talk, if one of you would like to kind of just briefly explain it and what you guys went through.
Yeah, I can start off. So A Long Talk is a training that had 3 parts to it that we all went through, and it's an anti-racism training, and it also provides tools to help you combat racism.
Awesome. So what really went on through it? Was it just a straight, like a slideshow or something like that, or more of a presentation? Do we have guest speakers?
Yeah, I remember the way we got introduced to it. We started off by watching this, I think, 40-minute video by this filmmaker for the ACLU. I think that's the acronym. Jeffrey Robinson, about history of race in America. And that was kind of, I think it was a good starting point, just about all of this racist history in America that kind of goes unnoticed when we're talking about I guess American history in the last 250 years especially. And after that we had our 3 sessions, and I think it was a good mix of not only presentations, but I really appreciated how it was also a dialogue. We had some exercises of how we could encounter situations where there might need to be some intervention because of someone saying something wrong. I thought it was a really well planned out program. Yeah.
Awesome. So you kind of alluded to, basically it started off with awareness, right? Because it's unfortunately a situation that still goes on, but I think it was probably conveyed that you guys needed to learn the history of it first before you start kind of jumping into ways to prevent it, it seems like, which is a great starting point, as you mentioned previously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think an important component to it as well, which Kamal started with, was that a history of racism in this country isn't just the history of people who've been victims of racism. You don't get to decide that that's not your history. This is American history, and as Americans and people in America, this is history we all need to know about and identify with ourselves, because we all have participated in that and continue to participate in that history. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a problem that will continue, and that's why we have these diversity campaigns that we like to express diversity and kind of combat racism with. Now, during these 3 sessions that all of your teams went through, what messages kind of during the presentation, or were there certain exercises that kind of impacted you the most?
Yeah, for me personally, it was the 3rd session. We did an interactive portion where someone would say something problematic, and then you would practice about how you would go about correcting it in a way. And that was actually very productive, because a lot of times in the moment you don't know how to actually act or what to say, and so this was
it could be awkward at times. Absolutely,
exactly. So this definitely helped prepare us and was one step towards learning how to practice anti-racism.
That's great.
Yeah, I agree. I really liked the interactive part, because I guess it's just practice for something that could really happen in real life. I think like the first session and kind of that lead up while watching that video was probably the most impactful for me, just because like growing up in America and like not knowing a lot of these pieces of history that we were talking about, it kind of made me a little upset about not knowing this whole piece of American history that really shows how much I guess we've neglected a certain perspective that would be maybe not the best look for America, but it's still like very important in realizing like how we got here today.
Right. Yeah, and again, it can't be ignored. Unfortunately, it happened, but it can't be ignored.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's a big reason on why, first of all, I'm sure all your teams did the program, but second of all, it's kind of like it can't be ignored, but here's how we're going to prevent these possible things from happening again so we don't have to continuously do this for years to come. Ben, were there any messages that kind of impacted you or any exercises that you thought were very interesting in this?
I think it was on day one. Use the example of smoking. So like, I don't know, let's say in the 50s or the 60s, smoking was just a normal practice. Like people could smoke on planes, people could smoke, inside buildings, wherever it may be. And as a society, we slowly decided that, smokers can continue to smoke, but if you're going to smoke, go over there. Go away from us. You're not going to smoke with us. And he talked about sort of applying the same logic to racism and any sort of discriminatory behavior in terms of we may not be able to stop that behavior, but we can say we as a society are going to be over here. And, like, if you want to be racist, if you want to be homophobic, like, you can go outside. You're not going to be in here with us.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a interesting kind of perspective there, the way that Kamal kind of formed that. So I didn't go through that training just yet. So what you just told me kind of surprised me. Were there any things that surprised you throughout these sessions or presentations or anything like that?
For me, it was just really like disheartening growing up in a public school and not have heard that perspective of history. It just shows how systemic of an issue that this is and how deeply embedded it is within our culture to completely have left out that side of history.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like schools before higher education shine a light on it, but it's kind of just a dim light, right? They only spend a day or two on it and then move on to whatever other lessons they do. So the fact that we are looking at this situation more in depth, again, is going to better prepare us on how to handle it in the future. Yeah,
I think kind of going back to the last question, I just remembered like two examples that also really stuck with me from what we learned in like that first session. I remember learning about how like there were a lot of elected people in like the Senate and as like representatives who were like freed slaves, who were black, like after like the Civil War, and I had never known that, and then additionally learning about like the Black Wall Street and how there was a massacre that just ended that, and I feel like I agree, it's kind of disheartening to know that even though I went to a school where we had like a whole year-long course about the American experience and American history, how we didn't really touch upon things like this. And I think it's just, really sad. Like a lot of things get left out while talking about American history. So I'm glad like I know that knowledge now. And I think, overall, a long talk really helped with like embedding those like extra pieces of history into like my knowledge, and I guess also knowing how to kind of reconcile with like this systemic issue that we have.
Right. And unfortunately, like I said, racism still sadly occurs today. However, when looking back in American history, it's kind of bewildering at times to see the extent of the racism that went on back then. And it's crazy to think like how awful it was. So again, I think this program really showed how to prevent certain aspects of it, but you needed to be educated first before you could truly understand how to combat it. Ben, were there anything else that kind of surprised you during the programs or sessions?
A message that was repeated a couple times, which wasn't itself surprising, was like, if black people could have ended racism and white supremacy by now, they would have. That was repeated multiple times. And sort of expanding on that, we learned a bit about, the numerous white civil rights advocates who we've never learned about. We did learn a lot about the history of racism in America and discrimination against black people and people of color, events which we haven't learned about, but we also learned about, white people who have contributed to the civil rights movement and who have contributed to anti-racism, who we haven't heard about. And the message on that was that, we've heard about, Malcolm X, we've learned about, Dr. King, people like that, but we don't hear about white people who have also contributed to the civil rights movement because of this idea that it shouldn't be a white person issue, whether it be in our education or whatever it may be. The system wants us to believe that this is something black people are dealing with, this is a black person issue, this isn't us as white America, this isn't our issue. And in fact, we do need to step in. And in fact, when white people have stepped in, they have made, major contributions. We just may not have learned about them. Right,
and that's an excellent point because I'm glad all three of you went through that education and training because, the white activist leaders aren't really talked about, as you mentioned. And that obviously needs to be talked about more because, unfortunately, in today's society with racism, it's not just African Americans that are being disrespected. There's tons of different other groups in the world and in the country that have to deal with the same stuff. And it's an issue for everyone. It's not just, white, black, simple as that. Everyone has to deal with this. So I think with proper education, we can learn how to deal with that, how to understand it, and then prevent it for years to come, hopefully. Now, moving to the physical aspect of the presentation, I know it was talked about. We did some possible scenarios. We ran through scenarios. We did actual slides, I believe, as well, and videos. What elements did you like about the presentation itself, Brianna, if you would like to start?
Yeah, sure. I was just appreciative of how interactive the whole presentation was.
That's what Sienna alluded to yesterday as well.
Yeah, it was phenomenally done. I mean, the first day starting with a video, and then it progressed into a live Zoom call, and then eventually it progressed into an in-person on the last day presentation. So each day kind of progressed more and more to being more interactive, and I was just so appreciative of how engaged everyone was during it, and I think that is because of how well the presenters performed.
That's awesome. I feel like you can give information to somebody and you could show a PowerPoint and you can just talk and talk and talk, but is that going to resonate with somebody? Are they going to be able to retain that information? I think the more physical a presentation is, I think that is certainly a lot more interesting to the students or whoever is looking at the presentation. So it sounds like it was very kind of, I don't want to say the word inspiring, but very or entertaining. I don't want to use that word either, but it's easy to retain that information if you're not just sitting there staring at, presentation.
Exactly.
Yeah. How did you feel, Aman, about any of the elements? Was there anything that really struck you? I know you enjoyed the kind of scenarios you went through.
Yeah, I also really appreciated how throughout the 3 sessions, it never felt like just looking at slides and just trying to listen to everything that was kind of being told. It was definitely more of a discussion throughout the whole thing.
That's good. I feel like trying to, and not to cut you off, I apologize. No. I feel like trying to make it as informal as possible is probably the way to go as well.
Yeah. So, in addition to us kind of having videos to watch and like the guys like telling us kind of what they wanted to impart on us. Like, I think it didn't feel like a very like formal environment. I thought we had ample opportunities to talk about our experiences as well with everything that we were talking about. And yeah, I think that the third session that was in person, where we got to also act out these scenarios, again, we kind of mentioned it, but I thought that was also like a good addition into like how interactive this was, kind of giving us a toolkit of just actually being able to confront these types of situations.
That's a great way of putting it, the phrase toolkit, because now I feel like, I'm sure as all three of you went through this program and training and sessions, you're now better prepared, right? If you see a situation, you're going to understand and know how to act, as opposed to being possibly caught off guard in real time in a real situation.
Yeah, I feel like, not that I didn't know about, I guess, how to recognize what's wrong before, but kind of now knowing like all of this context and history, like how to approach these situations realistically and with like that knowledge in mind, without it kind of overstepping any boundaries or like calling out on like character necessarily, just like knowing that it's like more flawed ideology as well.
Interesting. Were there any other like physical elements about the presentation that you were kind of captivated by, Ben?
I mean, I think to begin with, he told a number of great stories. One which really hit home for me was the one he started with. He talked about, dealing with racism in the men's basketball program at Gettysburg. And Gettysburg's obviously in the Centennial Conference. We play against them.
Right.
So
it's going to hit home a little harder. I know Sienna mentioned that in our podcast yesterday.
Right. So there was that component of it, and both Aman and Brianna have mentioned like the interactive component. I think toolkit is really the perfect word, because they broke it down as the CPR method. So like clarifying, let me pull it up. I forgot the acronym. So clarifying, probing, and recognizing, and really, what that meant was approaching like derogatory comments or racist comments, homophobic comments, whatever it may be, with like a questioning approach. Like, there's going to be no benefit if you go into it trying to argue with someone, trying to prove your point, even if you are right, even if they are being racist. Going into it with questions really, opens their eyes and allows you to interact with them for a longer period of time and interact with them in a more productive way. And I think I really got a lot out of that, because obviously the point of the long talk and the point of this programming was to do with racism, but I really saw a lot of applications to any form of discrimination, and in that particular activity, any form of discrimination you may hear verbally, whether it's someone saying she plays like a girl, or someone saying like he looks gay or something like that. All of these comments, really seeking them out and finding how we deal with them and how we no longer allow those to be part of our environment and society.
Wow. That's a great way of putting it into something that we can kind of truly understand for those that were not there. So our final question here in this discussion about a long talk is, what can you really apply, or how can you apply what you learned on campus with now all of these new tools that you're kind of equipped with?
Ben kind of already mentioned this, but for me, what I most took away was the questioning aspect. So when someone does say something that is discriminatory or just not okay and acceptable to say, rather than arguing, the questioning method to me is just so much more like you get something more out of it, because it's like, why are you thinking the way you're thinking, and you're getting more to the root of the issue rather than going back and forth debating. And it's just a good perspective to have of like, I don't know all the answers, and I'm not going to be here to fact check you, but I do know like what you said was not okay, and I'm going to make you question and think about, what did you just say? And
I like that. I like that.
First step.
Again, instead of just, coming at them negatively, to find the root of the problem, like you said, and kind of just see like, what conveyed you in that situation to say that, rather than what you're saying is wrong, which I'm sure it is wrong, but we'd rather fight and figure out, where is that coming from? What kind of place is that coming from? And how can we solve whatever issue they're facing in real life? How can we solve that to force them not to say something like that again? So that's a great point.
Yeah, I think what Ben said earlier with the questioning approach, just like being inquisitive whenever you do encounter an instance of like discriminatory behavior, microaggressions and all that, like getting to the root problem of just like thinking about like why they believe that, or like what propels someone to say something that is discriminatory. And I think even going beyond like learning how to deal with those type of occurrences, I also took away just learning to be inquisitive about history, and just like really learning about American history in like a new lens, and really thinking about like why we have these systems of oppression and kind of how it got to this point, and like thinking about why certain things that are pretty important have just been left out of basically like entire high school curriculums. I thought that was another thing that I took away, just like trying to put in a little more work of like understanding our history as a country in a broader context.
Interesting. Ben, would you like to add as well?
Yeah, I think what was important for me is that we did this in our teams and as a team for a reason. Because whatever tools we learned, particularly the most impactful one, like we've talked about, was this questioning technique, the CPR technique. But those are only so useful as much as you practice them. We're only going to be good at questioning people and actually getting out of them what they mean and working to like counteract racism if we practice these techniques, just the same as like any skill you practice in a sport.
Right.
So I think I really got a sense that like, practice this with your teams. Like if you're on a team bus or if you're in the locker room or something, just have someone say something stupid, something ignorant, something racist, homophobic, whatever it may be. And that element of practicing it. And the other thing I left with, like I mentioned, was a sense that this applies for all forms of discrimination. Mm-hmm. I think in sports, two other big forms of discrimination are sexism and homophobia, particularly maybe in the way we talk, in the way we act, in the way we think about sports. And I think, I felt it was really powerful that we have these tools which apply for counteracting racism, but also help us when we deal with homophobia, when we deal with sexism, when we deal with any form, xenophobia, whatever form of discrimination it may be in sports or otherwise. We're sort of equipped and ready to go.
Yeah, I like that you kind of pointed out that you did it with your teams, because in the middle, in the heat of the season and competition, tensions kind of rise a bit when there's competition involved, and unfortunately things get said that shouldn't be said. So now that it's not just you, right, your whole team, all of your teams have been kind of prepared in this situation, you can better handle that when the time comes in a real life situation. So it seems like a long talk has impacted all three of you, and I'm sure the rest of your teams as well, which is great to hear. So that will actually conclude today's episode, where we recapped and kind of summarized a long talk and talked about all the messages conveyed and how all of our student athletes here are going to be able to apply what they learned on campus. This is the second episode of a 3-episode diversity and inclusion themed podcast that we will be pushing out during the diversity and inclusion 3-day social media campaign sponsored by the NCAA starting the week of October 15th. For all of us here, Ben, Brianna, and Aman, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm your host, Matt Nissenfeld. Thank you so much for listening, and please enjoy the rest of your day.